Sure. Hello. No problem. Good evening, a very warm welcome, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Kilbride live speakers event. Tonight's event has been brought to you across multiple platforms courtesy of our friends at Independence Live, and of course will be available after the live broadcast in both indylive.net site and later as a podcast via the Indie Live radio channel. So you get plenty of opportunity to share the event with all your friends and family who may be unavailable to see it tonight. These events are all, of course, about you, the audience, whether you're for or against independence, or indeed are still yet to decide. As such, in the second half tonight, we'll be putting your questions and points to our panel of speakers, which you can raise using the hashtag YEKRTI on any of our social media platforms. You can do this now, so certainly get your questions in as soon as possible. Tonight will be the second event in our current series in which we'll be discussing and debating the routes to independence. The next milestone in that journey will be the up-and-coming Scottish election, which is only a matter of weeks away. There can be no doubt of the importance of securing an SNP majority at this election. To many, this will be, in essence, the rubber stamp in which the will of the sovereign Scottish people is indeed to revisit the constitutional question. But what follows next? Do we need a Section 30 order? Will the Tory government Westminster approve the use of the Section 30 order? And if we're part of a so-called union of equals, then why do we even need to ask permission? Well, tonight to discuss this with all of you, we've got three outstanding speakers from across the Yes movement, all of whom are here making their debut at a Yes Kilbride event, which we're thankful of. Our first speaker of the evening is a recently retired teacher, a long-time campaigner against fascism and racism. She is a socialist, a trade unionist, and a member of Yes Glasgow Northwest, and most recently was in the inaugural committee of the NowScotland group. Our first speaker of the evening is, of course, Charlotte Ahmed. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks very much, Paul, and hello to everyone out there. I hope you're all well. I hope you're all keeping good mental health, and thanks very much to Yes Kilbride for inviting me. It is quite an exciting time for those of us who are campaigning for independence, because those of us who've been in the movement for a while, we understand that this is the best time for independence. It's the best chance we've got for independence, but we need to seize the time. And one of the things that some of us decided, largely through the All Under One banner, demonstrations and assemblies that have taken place over the last year, demonstrations over a year ago, of course, before COVID came along, we decided that we wanted to have an organisation that would unite instead of divide, that would have an open platform for discussion, people from all over the indie movement, and also people who were moving from no to yes, no in the referendum in 2014, but are moving towards yes now. And we know that this is happening because all the recent polls, I think it's up to 22 now, show that there is still a majority for independence and for independence supporting parties in Scotland. This is despite everything else that's happening. And even today, I think the polls showed a majority for parties supporting independence. So despite everything else that's happening, that support for independence is creeping up, and it's been constant for over a year. And you can see why that is the case. We've got a climate crisis. We've got an economic crisis, which was actually unfolding even before COVID, and then we've got the pandemic. And the three things together have made people realise that we can't continue as things were before, that we need change, we need radical. And when I say radical, I mean radical. I don't mean it like some of these mainstream politicians. Yes, we need radical reform. We need a fundamental change in how things are run. Because if there isn't, the increased inequalities that COVID have thrown up, and we know this in Scotland, the persistent pockets of poverty in Scotland, the huge gaps in wealth in just in a matter of a mile, that life expectancy is 10 years difference between two places in the outskirts of Glasgow compared to other parts. And this has continued, this has been persistent through the whole time of the last 10, 12 years of austerity. And that gap is widening. Some people in the pandemic have got really, really rich. Some people are doing brilliantly, and yet the vast majority of people are struggling. Even people who before never thought they would struggle economically are struggling now. We recognise a group now called the working poor, where the benefit system is such that even if you work, you're not providing enough for a family. Young people can't leave their home, parents' home. Got some experience of this here. That's why I'm stuck in the bedroom. I've still got everybody in the house with their own rooms. Can't kick them out to get a meeting. So people are suffering real material hardship. The COVID pandemic, which the death rate for this in the UK, including Scotland, is one of the highest in the world. I mean, we talk about the COVID death rate, the total in America being 500,000. No doubt exceeding it now, but as per population, it's actually a higher death rate in the UK. Why is that? Well, we're run by the Tories. In Scotland, we're run by a Tory Westminster government that we didn't vote for. We haven't voted Tory in Scotland since 1955. So there's an increased realisation of the democratic deficit that what Scotland votes for, it doesn't get. And the climate change, the thing that motivated so many young people, is continuing apace. We've seen extremes of weather, even in Scotland. We've seen increased flooding, we've seen increased areas of drought, etc. But nobody wins if nobody tackles the climate crisis. And Nicola Sturgeon declared a climate emergency, but there's not been much done about it by the Scottish government. And so there's a growing realisation, I think, the combination of all this, that we need fundamental change. And some people are agreeing that actually if Scotland ran itself for its own people, we would actually be able to tackle some of these issues. Now, a lot of people in the movement, I mean, you will know what I'm talking about if you've been in this movement for a while. We like talking to each other on social media. It sometimes feels like a bit of a goldfish bowl. From an All Under One assembly that took place last year, some of us recognised and wanted to have this forum that we have now created called NowScotland. From an assembly, an inaugural committee of 15 people were elected by the people who attended the assembly. And since we've started, we've been trying to bring this organisation together. We launched a website a couple of weeks ago. We've got some social media. But the driving force behind this was to do something that this movement at the moment is finding very difficult, and that is to get unity. You've got splits, obviously, the things that are going on in the SNP. I'm not an SNP member. There are very, very divisive issues. Everybody knows about them. And the worrying thing is that whether we like it or not, the SNP is still going to be the most influential part of this independence movement. We want to maximise the vote for independence and independent supporting parties in the coming May elections. But the SNP hasn't done anything to further that vote. On the contrary, apart from Nicola Sturgeon being very competent and, if you like, leading from the front on the COVID pandemic, the fact is that the disaster of the care homes initially was something that could have been avoided. The slight difference in lockdown and coming out of various phases of lockdown, she's obviously more competent and better than Boris Johnson, but who wouldn't be? But the problem is that within that party, many people are now totally divided, totally demoralised about whether or not they are serious about independence, and independence now, not independence in 4 or 5 years. And people are leaving that party. And we're hoping that now Scotland becomes a bit of a home for people who want to discuss the different strategies towards independence, not in a sectarian way, but a way in which we have one goal, and that is to further the cause of independence. But within that, we recognise that there are various different strands. So, for example, I'm a socialist. I want to talk about the working class. I want to talk about workers' rights. I want to talk about employment and the minimum wage. I want to talk about nationalisation of the care and expansion of the health service, etc. There are some people in our movement who say, no, don't talk about anything. Don't talk about politics. Just talk about independence. And I think those people miss something, and that one of the reasons I've already tried to explain my opinion is why independence support is going up, is because we've got a new generation of people since 2014 referendum, young people who are motivated not by political parties anymore, but by issues, by climate, by anti-austerity, by housing, by land reform, by trade unionism, and also Black Lives Matter as well, issues of equality, motivate young people to take action. And I think that the way we're going to build the independence movement and get success this time compared to 2014 is to organise those people to be part of this independence movement. Now, obviously in lockdown, that is difficult, as you know. We have to do these things online. There have been a number of, I think, quite successful, socially distanced demonstrations with limited numbers at various strategic places. I think we should be talking about doing more of that in local areas, and I think we should be advertising them in forums like this. I think that we could, for example, put pressure, had there been an SNP Spring Conference, as far as I'm aware, there isn't going to be now. I was going to suggest maybe a lobby of that, to bring a bit of more urgency to it. I want to see more trade unions expressing an opinion, because obviously with what's happening within the Labour Party, there's a leadership election going on, but many of the people who were perhaps looked to Labour because they were inspired by Jeremy Corbyn will now be looking for something else and somewhere else to go. And I think the independence movement is a place for those people, and they should bring their talents and activity into it, and bring the issues that motivate them into it as well. So I'm very much somebody who wants to drive unity. I want to see the movement be more diverse than it's been, addressing these different issues, all under the campaign towards independence. But I really do think that time is running out. If you look at what the Tories are doing, they are obviously panicking that actually this movement is continuing despite the mess of the SNP. They've got their unit up, which has had two different leaders, the Union Army, as somebody called it, a little unit to discuss saving the Union. So they're very worried. They're worried about the effect of Brexit on the Northern Ireland issue. Also, there's an independence movement that's growing in Wales. So this is a real moving, living issue. And we have to, all the people involved in the movement have to mobilise. We have to inspire. I think we have to counteract the divisiveness of some of the issues that are coming. Sometimes people feel that they can't influence that. Well, there's other places other than the SNP in which you can have your say. But ultimately, we want to push for May to be the indication of a drive towards independence. And we want to see, now, I have to be careful what I say, because now Scotland as a body doesn't necessarily take a position on a number of different political issues, because we are unifying, we're trying to bring people together. The drive is for independence, but independence urgently. And so there is a debate about May, about whether or not that's going to be a plebiscite, whether or not you then go straight into a referendum. Section 30, we all know the Tories aren't going to grant it. Therefore, will the Scottish Government, assuming it's an independence majority, go immediately for a referendum, which they should do, obviously, and exercise the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine how they are governed? And that goes back centuries, as a matter of fact, in Scottish history. I don't necessarily like to always argue that, well, like, yeah, you know, a few hundred years ago, this happened, that happened, and it should be happening now. We're in a totally different economic situation. But I think if the leadership of the movement brings together all these different elements that I've mentioned earlier, I think we can be absolutely unstoppable. But we should look to leadership from the movement, not from the SNP, because it looks as if that organisation could scupper the best chance we have of this. And who knows what's going to happen after. So my message from Now Scotland is to unite towards independence, get interactive with whatever bodies you're part of for this, get into the streets as soon as we can. We want to use, if you remember, things like banner drops, posters in windows, things like small demonstrations outside centres of government and councils, etc. We want to bring people together and bring the fact that this movement is now as big as it's ever been. Now, when lockdown finishes, I'm sure everybody is frustrated and biting to get out into the streets to demonstrate that. And I'm sure we will all do that. But I think it's incumbent on us within the movement to try and unite it around action towards independence. There'll be different opinions on that, people coming from different directions. But if we focus on unity in action, despite what's happening in the SNP and other on the Twitter sphere, which I think I was never on Twitter until recently, and I'm now regretting it because it's a sort of self-reflecting goldfish bowl. Outside, there are people who are desperate for change, and these are the people that we need to inspire and lead to get into this movement. And if we do that in another referendum, I'm absolutely convinced that we will win it this time, because we will be part of an international movement for freedom, for democracy, and for human rights. And this little country could be such an inspiration to so many more people. And we've got it in our hands to do it. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks very much for that. A good few points in there. I mean, particularly one of the key points that Charlotte mentioned there was also around the fact that especially the unionists seem to think that the route one is to attack the SNP, because if they shatter or remove the SNP, then the whole argument for independence kind of vanishes in thin air. But that's clearly not the case, and anyone that's involved in the Yes movement fully understands that, anyone that's had that exposure to date. So again, just a reminder, if you've got any questions that you want to put to Charlotte, just post them in any of our social media pages, on the YouTube, anything you're watching us through, under the YEKRTI hashtag. Our second speaker of the evening is an accredited journalist who has worked as a reporter for the STV and Radio Sputnik, where he was editor-in-chief. He has also worked for no less than 4 SNP MSPs in his career at the Scottish Parliament, and was the first elected convener of the SNP Staff Association. He has also held a number of PR positions at government at local government levels. He is, of course, Mark Hirst. Mark, over to you.
Thanks very much for allowing me to speak on this important topic, and one that's been the subject of a lot of debate, certainly amongst activists for the past few years. I should make clear from the outset that I firmly believe that the Section 30 approach, which the SNP leadership have made clear is the only legal and established method of securing a second Scottish independence referendum, is, in my view, a complete dead end. And I'd like to address 3 kind of specific areas, if I can, which will hopefully explain why I think that. Firstly, I think it's worth pointing out that the SNP leadership have allowed themselves to go down this cul-de-sac with their eyes wide open. I think it's been a deliberate approach, knowing fine well that they have no intention of actually delivering independence anytime soon. Secondly, is the issue it raises and reveals about the longer strategy or objectives of this current SNP leadership, and what the Section 30 approach reveals about how imminently the SNP believe independence can be secured. And finally, I'd like to talk about some of the other options the movement can actually embrace and bring about independence. So first of all, what is this sexy sounding Section 30 all about anyway? I mean, a lot of people, it's strange. I mean, a lot of us in the movement talk about it just assuming that everyone knows what it is. And all too often we make assumptions about what Section 30 is and what effect it can have. But in summary, it's a mechanism for transferring powers to the Scottish Parliament that can enable us to hold a referendum. And there are actually 2 types of Section 30. There's a temporary Section 30 that allows it, as it says in the tin, as a short-lived transfer of specific powers to the Scottish Parliament for a specific purpose. And then there's a more permanent Section 30 that allows more permanent devolved matters to go to Holyrood. And these are generally passed or require an act of Parliament to achieve that. The one that is the focus of this event and debate across the movement over the past few years is, of course, temporary Section 30, a temporary transfer of powers to enable us to hold a second referendum. Now, I appreciate there's various legal opinions on whether this is actually necessary, as Martin Keatings is trying to reach an admirable determination over through the courts. But from my perspective, I think we should consider the wider options. Since the Parliament was reconvened in 1999, there has been 16 Section 30 orders granted, covering everything from reducing the voting age, all the way through to railways, devolved issues on railways, and of course, the historic independence referendum in 2016. And Section 30 was obviously a critical part of the so-called Edinburgh Agreement that paved the way for the 2014 vote. That's the boring and somewhat technical bit. So why has the SNP leadership adopted this approach specifically? Well, I think it's important to remind ourselves of how the SNP policy has evolved over time. When the policy was first adopted by the SNP in 2001, the policy to secure independence via a referenda, I and other active members in the SNP at the time were strongly opposed to it. The SNP position prior to that, in fact, since 1934, had been to secure a simple majority at a general election and then declare independence. Party strategists at the time, notably Alex Salmond, were strongly in favour of challenging the policy to one that adopted a consultative referendum that put the question in straightforward terms. And Salmond thought that this would remove the fear, as he believed existed in the minds of the wider electorate, that the SNP were an unknown quantity and that a dramatic, radical step to independence would be replaced with this transition, thus alleviating any concerns in the minds of the wider public. But devolution was really sold to the independence movement as a transition and not the final destination. The belief was that if you were to demonstrate to the public that you were incompetent in government, you're not going to frighten the horses, and you could manage government without drama. And of course, the introduction of devolution in 1999 changed the political landscape fundamentally. If you could do that, then you could convince people more easily to move towards independence. And among those who opposed this change in policy was the SNP MSP Alex Neil, and he argued unsuccessfully that the change of policy effectively meant that the SNP had become the only political party in Europe that effectively said to its voters, vote for us and we will not implement our core vote, our core policy, but we will ask you again to make sure that you're certain in a second separate vote. And it also opened up the prospect of having another referendum, even if a yes majority was secured, by allowing the electorate to vote on the terms of any treaty that we would negotiate with England that would formalise our independence. And hardened unionists warned against the spectre of Scotland being locked in a cycle of never-endums, spooky language, never-endums. And although I understand the reasons for the adoption of the independence referendum policy back then, I do not think that argument or those arguments remain sustainable now. Devolution has normalised the use of referenda as a way to secure independence, but it's not how states have secured their independence historically, and it's not a normal method of establishing, or in our case, re-establishing ourselves as a sovereign nation state. The SNP have been in power and in devolved government now for 15 years. That is ample time to have demonstrated that they weren't going to wreck the joint. Now, although the SNP remain extremely popular, the polls reflect that, progress towards actually delivering independence since the last referendum in 2014 has been virtually non-existent, despite the encouraging polls. Polls are one thing, action is quite another. And if you take anything away from this evening, I hope it's a quote that I often used from Noam Chomsky, which is never judge a politician, any politician, by their rhetoric, but by their actions. And the current SNP leadership have been described as gradualists, and that explains, I suppose, the slow pace on delivery. I think it reflects their underlying direction and internal thought process towards actual delivery of independence. The Section 30 order route map, which has been presented as the only game in town, simply underscores that in my view. And it has emerged following advice from James Wolfe, the Lord Advocate, the head of the prosecuting authority, the Crown Office, who holds a dual mandate or a dual role as the head of that body, but he's also the government's senior legal advisor. It's Wolfe who's advised the cabinet and the First Minister specifically that this is the only legal method that can be taken to achieve a second independence referendum. Now, I think it's fair to say, you may have seen him in the last few days, but I think it's fair to say that the Lord Advocate is not exactly known for his radicalism, unless it involves trying to jail certain independence activists for daring to use well-known political metaphors. From my own experience, he's extremely radical in that regard. But from the discussions I've had with other senior legal people and others who know him, it is well understood that James Wolfe is a unionist, instinctive unionist. And I'm not suggesting that Lord Advocates should be selected on the basis of their political outlook vis-a-vis independence or not. I think that would be entirely wrong. But when consideration is being given to this critical issue of how Scotland can legally secure and deliver independence, that deliberation should be taken or should be given to as wide a range of options as possible, and not just the very narrow prospectus offered by Section 30. I think it would have been beneficial for the SNP to have established some kind of panel, a constitutional legal expert panel, that would have set out all the options with their merits. And at present, the SNP leadership have tied their hands with regard to Section 30. And it's entirely dependent upon the permission of England, and for the foreseeable time, the most right-wing Tory regime in living memory. I think that is why the Keating's case is as important as it is, and one that will force the SNP's hand to a certain extent, and force them, I hope, to consider the other options. I strongly suspect, though, that the elements within the current SNP leadership who are using the Section 30 cul-de-sac as a convenient political cover not to press independence and actually deliver it, have their own agenda. Some people might be surprised that I'm not suggesting that there are certain senior SNP figures who do not want independence. But my view has been formed through my own experience of working with the SNP parliamentary group at Holyrood over a period of 9 years, and my ongoing discussions with former and serving elected representatives of the SNP. I've occasionally referred to these individuals who are soft on independence by their own admission as Devo unionists. Now, they may, in a sense, they may be content if independence does happen someday far in the future, but at the moment they're quite comfortable with the way things are right now, and they're not really showing any indication that they want to move towards our collective goal. Now, how can I make that claim? How dare I make a claim like that? Well, I don't think this is a recent development. Around the time that the independence referendum policy was adopted, during the leadership of John Swinney, who's now obviously the Deputy First Minister, the Scotland on Sunday newspaper ran a story based on an anonymous source close to John Swinney. Now, where would the SNP leadership be without the reliance on anonymity? That's a debate for another time. But this quoted Swinney source, in my view, gave the game away. And I think he was trying to steer the narrative completely away from independence. He was signalling what I think senior figures present in the current SNP leadership might believe as a pragmatic approach, and others might regard as a sellout. The source told the Scotland on Sunday, and this is a direct quote, ultimately Scottish nationalists, i.e. independent supporters, are going to have to reconcile themselves with something less than full independence. Now, when I read that, I contacted the SNP National Secretary, Alistair Allen, to voice my concerns that this was signalling a fundamental change of direction in the way that the SNP had been going for 8 decades or more, and basically settling down to administer unionist rule, albeit devolved rule, in Scotland. Alistair assured me that that wasn't part of the wider thinking of the rest of the leadership, but I've remained unconvinced. And 18 years on, and reflecting back on that period, and particularly the period the SNP have been in power, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that this is exactly what has happened. A leadership that has become to reconcile itself with something less than full independence. It has settled in and settled down. Devo unionism today, and hopefully they will urge, no doubt, Devo max unionism tomorrow. But ultimately, Scotland's independence is pushed discreetly out of touch. There is also the not insignificant matter of the electoral promises and mandates on which we as a movement have had plenty, more than our fair share. I find it incredible to see SNP leadership loyalists insisting there are no previous mandates secured and we must secure this one in May and then we'll be on our way at last. That is plainly nonsense, yet the myth of that continues. So for any doubters out there, let me read this short extract from the SNP's own website. It's still alive earlier today. It might disappear down the same rabbit hole as Alex Salmon's contribution to the SNP's history, but this was still active a few hours ago, and it says, does the SNP have a mandate for a referendum on Scotland's future? The SNP Scottish Government has made clear to offer the people of Scotland a choice. The SNP has won 4 elections, the Scottish Parliament election 2016, the general election 2017, the European Parliament election and general election in 2019, with an explicit commitment to our manifesto to holding a referendum. So that's 4 mandates which they have claimed. The Scottish Parliament has also agreed twice now to deliver a referendum on Scottish independence. So we've got 6 mandates, but no actual delivery. So they are clear. Mandates, you know, we've secured them. There's an abundance of mandates. The problem isn't the need for more mandates. The issue at heart is how to translate that into independence, which the SNP leadership claim can only be done via a Section 30 permission slip from London. But the big problem is, by adopting that position, they themselves are undermining the mandates that have been given to them in good faith by our movement. What specifically will one more mandate do that the other 6 have failed to do? With the best will in the world, the SNP government, even if they had candidates elected to every council seat, every MSP and MP constituency in Scotland, could not force a Section 30 to be granted. It's not in their gift to offer. So how can they pledge in good faith at this election that they can, or at any time? There is no way they can make that pledge and fulfill it by themselves any more than voting SNP at the last election stopped Brexit. No amount of large yellow buses can change that fact. And what is worse has been the concerted effort to close down and sideline viable alternatives. And I'd like to briefly turn to those if I can. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the SNP position for decades was to win a simple majority at the Scottish general election and declare independence. It would mean that every vote cast would be a vote for independence. The counter-argument to that from those who have supported the parked in the cul-de-sac strategy is that it would lack international recognition. Really? Do they really believe that? But if that is true, how can any Scottish general election, or any UK general election indeed, for that matter, maintain international recognition as being fair, authentic expression of the democratic will of the people? Even the most authoritarian nations in the world probably took a large gulp when Trump was elected in the US, but they all had to accept it. The British government enthusiastically embraced Trump despite his obvious flaws. In Scotland, is Scotland uniquely placed as a democratic society to be completely ignored by the international community if we legitimately take part in an election and a majority is returned that supports independence? The only people who could refuse to reject that are people who don't believe in democracy. And that being the case, why should we care about whether they recognise us or not? Fawning to them will only encourage them. We need to hold our heads up. Independence is ours to take. It's our sovereign right as Scots. It is absolutely absurd to think that the EU would turn its back on Scotland, whether an independent Scotland sought membership of the EU or not. What possible message would that send to other nations globally that the primary exporters of the democratic model, the US, EU, collectively the West, as we refer to it, ignores a democratic state moving to become independent in fair and open elections? There are very good reasons to recognise Scotland's independence in such a situation, and almost entirely negative consequences for those self-styled democratic countries if they chose to ignore such a vote. Saying that, I think the SNP and the movement more widely needs to do much more to build international alliances and secure vocal support for our cause as a way of quickly ensuring our international friends move quickly to welcome Scotland back into the community, the international community, on our own terms when that eventually happens, as it will. At the heart of this debate, however, rests the question of sovereignty. It's been well established in the courts, in the Scottish courts, that the concept of what's known as unlimited sovereignty of Parliament, i.e. the sovereignty of the UK Parliament, is a distinctly English constitutional and legal one. It has no counterpart in Scotland. In several cases, notably famous case in 1953, McCormick versus the Lord Advocate case, demonstrated this, and in fact the Lord Advocate of the day conceded that point. I doubt the current Lord Advocate would accept that concept given his actions in office so far. Again, that's another story. Similar legal arguments about the sovereignty resting with the Scottish people were also made during the case brought by Joanna Cherry QC, which was upheld by both the Scottish courts and eventually by the UK Supreme Court. We, us Scots, are sovereign. We have the power and legitimacy to exercise that sovereignty in any way we wish, and a democratic mandate secured in a general election where a majority of candidates elected did so on the basis of that support for independence should be enough. It is disheartening, to say the least, to witness in recent years senior SNP figures say that the only way forward is the consent of Westminster. There was a time when John Swinney openly talked about telling the Brits where to get off, in his own words. But devolution has tempered him, and now he insists that independence can only be achieved by working in partnership with Westminster, as if somehow a regime that's just killed more than 120,000 of its own people through its own incompetent handling of COVID will make a suitable partner to secure our national independence. It's just not rational to believe they would agree to that, given the economic and strategic importance Scotland has for the regime in London. So what do we do if England says no? If we somehow secure yet another referendum, but Westminster says, but, or if we use a general election to win and declare our independence and England says no, then what do we do? It's important to demonstrate that we have a legitimate mandate. I agree entirely with that. But that legitimacy is dependent on what we decide is legitimate and not on what others may or may decide is illegitimate, because we are sovereign. It's absolutely not determinate on permission from anyone but our own people. And you don't have to study closely the imperial history of Britain and England to realise that we are dealing with an aggressive, superior-minded opponent with, as the former UK Foreign Minister Jack Straw noted, has a propensity to violence that has been used to subjugate Scotland. That was his words. How we respond to that potential threat will ultimately determine how successful we will be. But my view would be that any response should be peaceful, but very determined. That may ultimately lead to a process of peaceful civil disobedience in the likely scenario that we secure our own self-determined legitimate mandate, but which is actively resisted by Westminster. We are not at that point now, but I think it is important that we show a determination at an early stage that we are on the march. We have only one destination in mind, and no contrived obstacle or barrier will be allowed to stop us from reaching that goal. Time isn't on our side. The people cannot wait for even the most optimistic target, as suggested by Andrew Wilson, one of Nicola Sturgeon's closest advisors, of perhaps 10 or 15 years. The UK regime represent a clear and present danger to all Scots, to all of us. Rather than having a rigid, strictly defined and inflexible mechanism, which Section 30 is, and in light of the ruthless and uncaring Tory regime we face for perhaps the next 18 years, we must set our own path and our own timescale, whatever that takes. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Mark. A lot of great points there. Again, if you've got questions or you want to challenge anything that Mark said, get your questions in through the hashtag. Well, that takes us on to our final speaker of the evening, which we're on pretty quick. Our final speaker of the evening is another long-term supporter of independence. She is an academic who lectures in social work and has been an active trade unionist for many years and also operates actively in community and development projects. In previous years, she has stood as a candidate at the Scottish elections and is now a member of Action for Independence and currently the Equalities Officer for the Solidarity Party. Our third speaker of the evening is Lynn Sheridan. Over to you, Lynn.
Thanks, Paul. Can you see me okay? I've had to move computers because my other one and my work's computer wasn't letting me.
Yeah, you're fine. You're all good.
Yeah, okay, good stuff. I'd like to thank you first of all for your invite to me, and to listening to the previous two speakers. I think it's been a really interesting discussion and debate so far. I suppose my contribution tonight will be more around the electoral processes that we face and the decisions that we're going to have to make as a nation at these elections in May. Can I first of all say that my party have stood, as you say, in previous elections, and that the last elections in 2016 actually stood as a candidate for Solidarity in Central Region. I used to work in Central Region when I worked for the social work department there, and lived in the local area in Bells Hill. So I've got a good understanding of the issues around the local areas there. But that's not what I'm here to speak about tonight. What I want to say is that I think that this election is one of the most vital elections that we're ever going to face in Scotland, because we need to make sure that we get as big a turnout, and that we, more importantly, we think about how we're going to vote in the up and coming election, because the unionists are going to use the tactics that they used in the past in terms of trying to get people to vote tactically. So saying to each other, who's got the best chance of winning a seat in these areas. And we can see from previous elections, I'll go into this in a bit more detail, but they have done that successfully. So AFI, Action for Independence, or what we wanted to be called was Alliance for Independence, but the Electoral Commission put the kibosh on that. And that's the reason why there's been a bit of a delay in us getting registered with the Electoral Commission, because they kept coming back to us and saying that certain things had to be changed, whatever. And it's taken them up until 2 weeks ago tomorrow to allow us to be registered as a political party and to be able to stand in these elections. So I just want to say to everyone out there that they think, no, we're Johnny-come-latelys or whatever. That's not the case. We've been very, very frustrated that we wouldn't be allowed to stand at all. But now that we have got political status, then we are moving forward. And Solidarity took the decision to come under the umbrella of AFI, as I'll use the acronym to shorten it. And I think it's important to say that we're not the only political party who are negotiating currently with the AFI steering group, which I'm a member of. It is important to emphasise that there are small yes supporters across Scotland who have already joined us through our website. It's free to join. Can I just put a wee advert out there? Please come have a look at the website, tell us what you think, become a supporter. We're going to be standing in the regional seats. So we're not going to be opposing the SNP in any of the constituencies across Scotland. So 73 constituencies, we won't be standing candidates. We're only going to be standing in the regional seats. And I think it's important to go through some of the questions that are being asked in terms of this election. And one of the first is that you can't game the system. Well, I think that's obviously incorrect. If you look at what the unionist parties did in 2016, as I say, they took tactical positions in terms of their voting. And we see from the Tories, for example, they actually doubled the number of MSPs that they got into the Parliament. They went from 12 to, I think it was 24 MSPs. So we need to get rid of that myth we're not the ones who've tried to game the system. If we think back historically to the 1970s, where we had the fixed assembly vote back then, we then had the suppression of the McNaught report, and anyone who's interested in independence really needs to go and look at the McNaught report and what it said about us as a nation, what it said about how we could stand on our own 2 feet, because we are big enough, we are rich enough, and we're certainly brainy enough in terms of historically, if you think of the inventions and the academics that have come out of Scotland, in terms of all of the inventions that are used across the world now, and I'm not got time to go into all of that, but they are aplenty. But we were used as an experiment back in the late 80s, early 90s by Margaret Thatcher in terms of the poll tax experience. Well, we put that to bed, didn't we? We set up the anti-poll tax campaign in Scotland. We ran major demonstrations. You know, Charlotte was talking about how we should be out in the streets. Well, that showed that the people of Scotland were not prepared to be the guinea pigs for Margaret Thatcher, and we beat that. We also defeated the bedroom tax with the help of the Scottish Parliament, because nobody in Scotland pays the bedroom tax, but the tax is still there, but it's paid for through the taxes that are raised in the Parliament's budget. So let's no longer be the guinea pigs, but let's be very honest and say that the unionists are going to be tactical voting. I mean, they've put out a leaflet in the last week which talks about the coming election. Not once do they mention that it's a leaflet by the Conservative Party, but they make 21 mentions in the leaflet of the SNP. So, you know, they are absolutely, I won't use the word on here, but they are, they're very fearful of what the power of people in Scotland. Another myth that I would, I suppose, like to bust is the one around that we would actually split the vote. And an SNP propaganda machine is saying the only way to get a Section 30, and Mark has covered that, and I really don't want to get into that in any more depth because he's given excellent coverage around that, but that we would split the vote, that the Tories will not be fearful if we get independence, pro-independence MSPs other than the SNP elected to the Scottish Parliament. Well, again, I would say that that is absolute rubbish. In the 2016 election, and I just want to look at my figures for this because it's an unbelievable figure, but in the 2016 elections, across the whole of Scotland, there were 953,587 votes for the regional list seats for the SNP. Almost a million, just under a million votes for the SNP in the second vote, the peach ballot paper. What did that result in for the SNP? What it resulted in was 4 additional regional SNP members to the Parliament across the whole of Scotland. 4. And 3 of those were in the south of Scotland, and 1 of them was in the Highlands and Islands. So across central Scotland, Glasgow, the Lothians, those second votes literally went in the bin. And the same will happen this time, because the polls, as Charlotte and yourself has said, Paul, 22 polls now. One just released today by STV News. All of them predicting that the SNP are likely to win 71, if not all 73, first past the post constituency seats. And if that happens, then all of those second votes that people give in good faith to the SNP go in the bin. Now, in places like central Scotland, all that is required for AFI to get just one seat is 5.4% of the votes cast in the second vote. So people that will say, "Oh, you're in cloud cuckoo land. There's no way you're going to get a seat, whatever." Well, the socialist parties in the past have shown that that is not the case. Back in 2011, there were, I think it was 9 socialist MPs elected to the Scottish Parliament. And what we're asking is that you consider giving AFI your second vote. Because the way the Hoyt system works, which is the system that's used for Holyrood elections, is that the better you do in the first vote, in terms of you get each of the constituencies has 9 constituency, each of the regions has 9 constituency seats. So if you win those all those 9 seats, it's 9 plus 1 is the divide then into your election votes in the second ballot. So there is no way, if the SNP were to win the 73 seats, that it's likely for them to get regional MSPs out of this election. But if people think about how they're going to vote, and don't vote necessarily with your heart, but vote with your head, then we can take some of those seats. So I suppose the next question then is, what are we going to do if we get into the Parliament? Well, the whole raison d'etre of AFI is to max the yes vote, to get MSPs into the Scottish Parliament to support the SNP. We're asking people to vote SNP 1 and AFI 2. And we have said that we will give a commitment that all of our MSPs will support the government in a push towards an independence referendum. Now, Mark made the points about the Section 30 and whether we'll ever get it or not. I think that we had an ideal opportunity with the support that could have been given by the Scottish Government to Martin Keating's case around whether or not the Scottish Government has the authority to call its own section, to ignore the Section 30 and to call the referendum. They've not done that. And it was an ideal opportunity to do that. But if elected, then we will push to have another legal case to make sure that the people of Scotland get the opportunity to vote for independence. And why is that so important? Why are we not content to live with a devolved Parliament? Well, I think we can see through the COVID crisis that the issues that we would want to have addressed, we weren't allowed to do so. So, for example, shutting down our borders. We don't have, in terms of immigration and other things, we don't have the authority to do that. If we want to recover economically from COVID, it's essential that we do that through an independent Scotland. And if, as the majority in Scotland voted to remain in Europe, then once we get our independence, let's have a referendum on whether we rejoin the European Union. Let the people of Scotland have that decision. But we're not going to be able to do that under the current devolved Parliament. And so we have a situation in Scotland where thousands and thousands of young people are being restricted in terms of their movement. There's no freedom of movement any longer. We are out of Erasmus, which means that many thousands of students are not going to have the opportunity to go to other European countries to live and to study. Now, the government are talking about bringing in a new system called the Turing system, but to be honest, I don't think it's worth the paper it's written on, in terms of if you believe the Tories. So we get into Parliament, we support the SNP in terms of pushing first item on the agenda as far as we're concerned, if we get MSPs into the Parliament, is for a referendum on independence. But it's as important for me to be asking in the question section tonight, what is it people want from an independent Scotland? I know what I want. Charlotte has mentioned that some of the stuff around climate change and whatever. My areas of work have always been in relation to trade unionism and working for equality and child protection. I've got a vision of what I would like to see an independent Scotland do for children, our current children, and for the children that are going to come up behind them, children of the future. So I'll end my comments just by saying that I think if people go onto our website, we've got a 32-page analysis that we've done on the regional votes from 2011, 2016, and the projected votes for this election using the data from opinion polls, etc. An absolutely magnificent analysis that is done by one of our members. Have a look for your own region, see what's evident there, and please consider giving AFI your second vote. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lynn. A couple of good points there, and I think it's worthwhile just remembering the fact that yes, Kilbride is all parties and none. We're not backing any particular party at this current stance, and certainly we would recommend that you do your own research if you're looking at how you decide to vote in the election. Certainly we would be, we're certainly going to be holding future events through the same media, which will have many different people on represented to state this case, and certainly there's a lot to cover in that. We did invite SNP to join tonight. Unfortunately, there was no one able to attend. And certainly they still remit with the idea of that, going for the majority is the only way for receive a majority in May. And the Section 30 is the way that's still the legally binding way, as was detailed in the article late on in January from the National, from Mike Russell, which is definitely worth a read if you're looking to still make up your mind on that aspect of things. So, routes to independence. Well, you've heard the speakers tell you how they see it. It's now over to you, the most important part. Spotlight's over to you. On the questions front, we've had a great response so far, so keep them coming in. And we're going to kick all things off with a question, and it's the first question of the night, which comes in from Alison Clark. And the question is, and it's open to the panel, do you think there is a chance that we'll get a plebiscite election in May? If we start off with Mark.
Yeah, no is the answer. I don't think there's any remotely. I don't think there's any chance of that at all, and partly due to the fact that I know we're not going to get into that, but there's obviously a lot of turmoil going on just now, and the leadership aren't going to change their position on that. They've been quite firm on that. They've shot down, even within their own elected representatives, any notion that we would see a plebiscite election. So it's not going to happen. That's my view.
Fair enough. Charlotte, you get anything to add on that?
I just agree. It's not going to happen. I mean, the famous Plan B, what is it? Various different versions of what Plan B is. I don't think it's going to be considered as a plebiscite. I think there's problems as well if it is, but it won't be.
Lynn, anything different from your side?
No, 3-0 there, I think.
There you go, Alison. There's your answer.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that the SNP manifesto, when it comes out, will not have that in it, and that's where it needs to be if they were going to go for that. But it's being a bit of I like my wee poker nights, whatever, and being a bit of a wee gambler, I'd put a wee bet on that it's absolutely not going to be there.
Fair enough.
Not odds.
Okay, moving on to our next question. And this has come in from Stephen Kelly. And the question is, What do you think the true independence figures are at? So I'm guessing he's talking about in relation to the polls. Also, the polls have been creeping up, and there's also some noise just now of the things that are in the press and whether they're affecting the current view of support for independence. So, Charlotte, starting with you this time.
No, I think the number of polls that we've had and the consistency of the majority for independence is actually quite remarkable. I mean, I think we're actually in a very unique situation politically because we've got this one dominant party, and yet it's not fulfilling its single distinguishing objective, which is to get independence. And yet, nevertheless, the polls have consistently shown now over virtually the whole of this COVID lockdown that there is a majority for independence. Now, that majority, the polls can vary in how they work these things out. They can sometimes include those not decided. And there is some talk that the not decided could be the difference in any referendum that we eventually get. But the polls show consistently the SNP are heading for an overall majority, and polls show consistently majority opinion in favour of independence. So I think we have to congratulate the movement for making sure that that has been the case, because I don't think that is down to the SNP, and certainly not recently. So on that basis, we're at a far higher level now than we were prior to the 2014. And what Nicola Sturgeon referred to as the material change that would take place for her to be able to have another independence referendum. As I said earlier, the material change has already happened. We talk about, do you want the economic situation, do you want COVID, whatever, that material change has happened. And those polls should be taken by the SNP to show that there is a movement out here waiting for them to move. And hopefully, if they don't move, the people will. So I'm very, very pleased with the polls, but it's a tribute to the movement, not to the SNP, that they're still high and rising.
So Charlotte, on that as well, are you concerned about in taking the 2016 election into consideration? The SNP were sailing high walking into that, and I think a lot of people were surprised of how it turned out, obviously after the count. Should we be concerned about that, particularly again going back to Lynn's point of using your, and I don't like the term second vote, I think it's a bit misleading, but your regional vote to also support someone else, as many did for the Greens in the 2016 election?
Yeah, as NowScotland, because we're not a political party, we don't endorse any political party, just independence ones. So as NowScotland, we're not going to have a position on that. But it is a system that is designed to stop an overall majority taking place. That's why it was originally brought into existence, and yet it's failed on that because of the popularity of the SNP. And I would have to say they are very much helped by the demise of the Labour Party and the appalling Tories and the neoliberal economic policies that both those parties have been promoting. So no opposition in effect, and therefore, like it or not, this is the party of government. I agree with what Mark said earlier. It wouldn't surprise me if some of the members of the SNP hierarchy are very comfortable where they are. They've been in power, they look as if they're going to be in power again. We've got MPs sitting down in Westminster that don't do hellish much for the movement. I agree with some of Kevin McKenna, the journalist's analysis on that. You get a bit of bluff and bluster down in Westminster, but you could always write the script for you in Blackford. It's so samey and so ineffectual. So, there are people who have had a pretty good life out of sitting there in the bureaucracy of the Scottish government. And maybe they are frightened about what people want. They are frightened about taking that next step. And that's why I think a grassroots movement has to push them from below. Now, on the electoral front, I mean, as I say, as NowScotland, I can't take a position on how you vote as long as you vote for parties that are for independence. But I really do take Lynn's points, and they're very well made. And the figures that she put forward for the number of votes in the second vote for the SNP that only resulted in 4 MSPs. Something to think about, isn't it?
Absolutely. So Mark, over to you. Do you think the general feel matches what the polls have been coming in?
Yeah, I mean, I think agree with what Charlotte said in terms of that. I think the concern is, and I think this is why we're seeing the emergence of these alternative independence parties and organisations, is that people feel the time couldn't be more right. I mean, my worry was, after the 2016 Brexit referendum, the position of the SNP leadership was, we need to see how Brexit's going to pan out. We need to see for this material change, etc. And that was really hostage to fortune stuff. Everyone could tell, way back in 2016, it was going to be an absolute basket case of a scenario, certainly as far as Scotland's position was concerned. But it's been this stalling and this dithering. And I mean, even last year, the much trumpeted speech that Nicola gave in January last year, which ended up being a damp squib, where she said subsequently on the BBC Mars show that she wasn't going to move on independence until the legacy of COVID had been dealt with. Well, the economic legacy of COVID is going to be around for, well, at least a generation and possibly much, much longer. So I think part of the frustration in the Yes movement, and certainly speaking for myself, is that they're not going to get a better opportunity than this. And the other thing that's going to happen, we're already seeing that, after Brexit, the parties in England, or unionism generally, is consolidating with itself. There's this, even the people who were opposed to Brexit are saying, we've got to come together for the greater good of the country. And that all that energy is going to then be forced on our movement. And I think there's been a huge wasted opportunity. I think the day after the Brexit result, the planning should have been in place and the referendum campaign should have started there. But anyway, we're not there now. But there's no excuse for dithering any longer. And my big concern is that if, and it's a cleft stick, I want independence. I want a majority of independence representatives. But I worry that a huge mandate again might perversely or paradoxically lead to more complacency by the leadership saying, oh, everything's in safe hands and nothing changes. We don't move anything forward. And that open goal at the moment is lost.
And Lynn, much the same with yourself. Again, going back to the idea of the polls being high, if we're to cast a vote, and indeed, we take some of the options that you were discussing in your part there, if we find out that the SNP don't quite deliver in the up-and-coming election, are we going to find ourselves in a difficult situation?
I think we are. I mean, the polls, the pollsters got things dramatically wrong back for the UK elections, and they admitted that was the case a few years ago. But the consistency and the level of support for independence in the polls, I mean, that's 22 polls now. And, you have to ask, how many people is that based on? As an academic, when we're looking at research, we always say, what's the baseline? How many people were questioned and asked those questions? What are the questions that they're asking? And even on that basis, 22 polls, and we have consistently have now this support, touching on 50 to 55% for independence. Remember back in 2014, we started in a position of having less than 23% support for the independence referendum, and we got up to 45, 46%. We're starting from a foundation of that final 2014 figure. And yet, for me, the frustrating thing is that we're not in the 60s and the 70% in terms of support. And I think that is to do with the ineffectiveness of campaigns to push the independence agenda. But what I would also say is that, every time the new leader of the Unionist Party in Scotland, Douglas Ross, raises his wee yellow flag, it pushes up the support for independence. And Boris, well, to be honest, Boris is probably the best recruitment agent that you could ever have. I mean, how corrupt can you be as a government where you're giving all of these contracts in terms of COVID to your crony pals that run a pub to get a £13 million contract or whatever it might be, and the courts say that you've broken the law, and yet nobody, they're arrogant enough to say, oh, we don't need to resign. And I'll finish on, the points that Charlotte and Mark were saying about our impact in Westminster. When we voted in the last 2 general elections to send MPs to Westminster, we sent them there to settle up, not to settle down. And I think that the way that they are ridiculed and ignored on many occasions at the Westminster Parliament shows us that we need to get out, as I've said on Twitter a number of times, let's get out of Dodge. Let's get those people back up here to fight for the independence agenda rather than sitting in their backsides on the green benches.
Yep.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's again, it's just briefly about the point of the routes to independence, which is the kind of subject matter of this evening, is the fact that we only got that Section 30 order to allow us to have a referendum in 2014 is because they were so confident that no one was going to vote yes, and they only actually got a bit of a rude awakening in the week just before the referendum, also when they pulled the highly delivered not to vow to also try and trace it through. So,
absolutely,
particularly if our Brexit position is their be all and end all for everything, then they certainly can't allow Scotland to break away and be independent. So they'll just keep hold of us and obviously drag us down until there's nothing really worth fighting for in an independent Scotland for 50 years or something like that down the line. Yeah. Next question comes up, is more on the same subject matter. This is from William Forbes. Do you think after this election, if they don't get behind independence, they will end up losing the next election? So again, this is going back to the SNP's position and some points that Mark raised through in his piece, saying that if they don't deliver, particularly in the short part of the next term, does the support for the SNP potentially dive thereafter? Mark, if you want to come in on that one.
I don't know. There's a lot's going to happen between now and then, and yeah. Well, what I would say, I don't think. I mean, they're going to be around. Bearing in mind that they're a huge organisation, the SNP. There are difficulties that are going to have to be dealt with. Difficulties is probably an understatement, but there's certainly huge challenges up ahead. There's no doubt about that. But I wonder whether after what happens, happens, and after we get through the election, whether there'll be a radical correction in the kind of approach that whoever's in the leadership take, because there's huge divisions within the SNP actually. That's been played out in certain elements of the movement, and with the best will in the world, I think probably you're going to need some kind of unifying organisation or group of individuals who can bring things together. But I think, there's no point in trying to avoid the elephant in the room. There's going to be a bit of bloodletting between now and then, and how things fall after that will determine how the SNP get on thereafter. But this is a critical moment. There's no question about it. This is a hugely pivotal moment for our movement, for the cause. And I've said this, I've been asked this many times, what about the big, you already see it on social media, I'm not just saying the wheesh for Indy, but people saying forget all this and just concentrate on independence. And the strength of our movement is the grassroots. The grassroots movement is what's maintained, as Charlotte mentioned, is what's driven the rise, alongside a complete, what does it say about the opposition in Scotland? That you could have these ructions, these major ructions going on within the ruling Independence Party, and they're still massively ahead in the polls. But that's nothing to do with, I'm afraid, in my view, the leadership of the SNP, because in my opinion, and I've seen evidence of this, they haven't really driven it. And they've had, and as I say, there's this huge opportunity that we could have been well advanced on the road now. We wouldn't need to be one more mandate for this election. We could have been actually on the point of holding a second referendum on our own terms or whatever mandate we decided. And there might be a price to pay for that after the dust settles on this next turbulent period.
So Charlotte, again for yourself, I appreciate you've already reiterated you won't be backing a particular party under the Now Scotland agreement, but obviously, you know, you would be encouraging the lending the vote for the SNP. So is it something you're a bit concerned about, and certainly the group's concerned about the lack of potential delivery should the SNP not really deliver on the back of another mandate, so to speak?
Absolutely. I mean, let's assume that they get a majority, and there may be others, maybe AFI candidate, you know, people successfully elected, and what is the next step? And these bureaucracies that have been in these positions of power for a long time have an uncanny knack of stretching out into the future their plans for anything, you know, carrot and stick. Oh yes, we will do this. Yes, we will have a special conference. Yes, we'll have a constitutional convention. I think even with the best scenario, they will try and do that. But I think that is when the grassroots movement that we're trying to, you know, revive, and when it emerges out of lockdown, as it will, like a butterfly from a cocoon, we will have to be putting demands and dates, and when are you going to do this? We want this now. And therefore, what happens will depend on the strength of that movement. Because as Mark's pointed out, the SNP itself, I mean, if you think of Andrew Wilson's Growth Commission, it was a neoliberal document that wouldn't have been out of place on a Tory, you know, in a Tory policy document. And even within the SNP, there was a revolt against that. So, you know, in terms of the policies, in terms of the different opinions within the SNP, there's everything to play for. But I think because they have this inertia of being in power and very comfortable, some of them, that they have to be forced into doing something. Obviously, if we've got to get a majority in the Parliament for independence. I mean, that's the first thing. And therefore, in the election campaign, which I don't even know if it started yet, as for some people, maybe the SNP have another small issue to deal with first before they actually get round to it. But this is why we're having meetings like this, because there are these discussions. But I absolutely believe, and this is why Now Scotland, I think, I'm not going to say that Now Scotland is going to make the difference to whether we have that grassroots movement or not, but it's a genuine attempt to help mobilise and organise and create that movement that have to very, very quickly after the election begin to put the pressure on. Because I do think that, as Mark said earlier, no nation's ever won independence just through a referendum. You have to fight for it. I mean, we're breaking up the British state here. And look at the way the Tories, I mean, you've seen this with Keir Starmer as well, there's a Union Jack behind them every single time they speak on the telly. I mean, they could be speaking about a cup final and there'll be a Union Jack behind them. It is sickening. But that's what they've decided to do, because they want to hold on to this union, come what may. And if you remember, you mentioned the vow, they're going to find money and they're going to say, well, if it wasn't for the union, this factory wouldn't be open. They're going to give us money for this. They've already tried it around the vaccination. We have to challenge the SNP to be bold, because I don't think they will be bold unless they are forced. And that always comes from the people. The people have to take the decision. And I think it will be ultimately taken to the streets very soon after that May election, a statement of intent from the people in some way, whatever way is available to us, and hopefully it will be in the street. We have to show, right, we want dates, we want action, we want a conference, we want a referendum by this date. Because I do agree with the questioner, eventually people will lose faith, particularly in the SNP, as being interested in independence, and people will find other ways to fight, because they always do. Because the things we want to fight for, we're not going to go away necessarily. Even if you get independence, you'll still have to continue that fight. So if they're not serious about it, people will find other ways of doing it. So yes, if they don't get serious and take action, and we will, and the people are not able to force them to, they will go down. Historically, they will have had their moment. That's my opinion.
Thanks, Charlotte. And Lynn, just on a similar issue there. So I hear a lot of people saying that the reason the SNP hadn't pressed on with a referendum at an earlier juncture was mainly because although they may have returned a majority of SPs or MPs, but the fact was, is if you look at the actual votes, there was still more people voting for unionist parties as a whole, particularly in the previous Scottish election, when there was voting for, you know, what you would declare as a pro-independence party. So you think there's maybe something more to it than that?
I mean, the people have got the choice in terms of who they vote for, but if you've not got a definitive campaign in your manifesto of these are the timings that we're going to go for, then people will slide back. I don't think it was so much, if you look at the analysis of the votes for the last general election and the one previous to that, it wasn't that more people voted against the SNP, it was that they lost hundreds of thousands of votes from the 2016, I think, 2015 general election, when they were on a high in terms of the number of MPs that they sent to Westminster. Because of their inaction, people didn't get out the house and go and vote for them. They didn't necessarily, you never saw, the other parties maintained their vote percentage. So it wasn't that people decided not to vote SNP and went back to voting Labour or the Tories or whatever. It was that the SNP vote didn't get out, didn't galvanise itself to go out and vote. And I think that's this is their last chance, I think, from the people of Scotland to give them the opportunity to push this agenda. I mean, we've had the route map with the 11 points in it, but really, what does it say? It's not worth the paper it's written on because of the points that Mark has made around the issues of the Section 30. And in some ways, the COVID crisis has frustrated, I think, the indie movement even more because we've not been able to get out and physically show our frustration at their inactions on the streets. You know, thinking back to the big demo we had just before the lockdown in Edinburgh, you know, over almost 1 million people out in the streets. It was amazing. It was absolutely fantastic to see all, you know, across the range, the amount of people, old and young, able and not able, people getting out, in terms of the demographics of Scotland. There was every single demographic that you could think of on the streets in Edinburgh that day. It was absolutely fantastic. And the one that was held then in Glasgow was, you know, in the pouring rain was just as fantastic as well. So I think that their strategists need to take on board that people are not going to sit, you know, no matter whether it's the SNP or another political organisation. I don't think that really matters now. The majority of the Scottish public want to have independence. They want to be in charge of their own destiny. And no matter who it is that's taking that charge forward, it's going to happen. So, you know, whatever the machinations are that are going on internally within the SNP, people are determined to get the independence campaign up and running. We're all champing at the bit to move out level 5 or whatever it is we're in now to level 2 when we can actually start campaigning again on the streets and get out on the streets. And if the SNP as a political party don't take to the front of that campaign, then I'm sorry, but the others will take up the cudgels. And it might help Nicola and others if they were actually seen on a demo. The demonstrations that have been organised, the marches that have been organised by All Under One Banner. I've never once seen Nicola Sturgeon on any of those marches. So if they want to lead the people of Scotland into independence, they need to start getting to the front of the queue and leading us from the front and not just putting forward namby-pamby route maps to independence.
Actually takes us on nicely. The next question from Colin Jackson. It's the Yes movement needs a figurehead to get on TV and radio and debates. Do the panel agree? We'll start with, we'll go with Charlotte on that one.
I think our movement is full of leaders that are good on telly. You know, I'm looking at Paul there. I think we've got a depth of talent in the movement that is not used enough. And social media, I mean, it's in lockdown, we've all been forced to go on it more, all these Zoom meetings and everything. I had my reservations about them, and you know, they do get a bit sickening eventually, but nevertheless, they have allowed people to take a lead and to give a lead and to be part of discussions they might not otherwise have been part of. And then trade unions have found this as well. You can have a meeting, it doesn't need to be organised by the union bureaucracy. You know, it's been quite liberating. And I think, you know, when you look at the mainstream media, it's just appalling. I mean, everybody knows about this, and you know, there's talks about boycotting the BBC and all the rest of it. I don't see any one of them that is reflecting the grassroots movement, which has been shown to be there through the polls. Not one of them reflects that. They are either obsessed with the unionist side, or they're obsessed with, you know, what happens at the top of the SNP. They're not reflecting the grassroots. Now, it's always good to have people who have a profile already in the movement, and we've got them aplenty. I mean, there's artists, there's actors, there's people who are very vocal on blogs, sometimes when they shouldn't be, and your Twitter feeds and all that. But I think we want to encourage a new leadership, and you know, somebody who's listening to this could be equally capable compared to anybody else. And what the other good thing, it's refreshing. You don't come with the baggage that other people have with them. You don't come with a sense of entitlement that sometimes some of these people reek off. Because I've been in the movement 50 years, I've got seniority over some new young activist. And one of the things about it is that the publicity that we get does not reflect the nature of the movement. Because if you look at the polls broken down in age ranges, where's the highest percentage for independents? It's the 16s to 24s. And where do they get a voice on the media? They don't. So I'm personally a bit of iconoclastic. I don't like leaders that are the one and only true leader. I would much rather have the strength of the movement reflected in a variety of people who have the confidence to get out and speak. And hopefully we'll see that, you know, other Yes groups and other groups like NowScotland will be organising meetings. People can get up and have a chance to speak, and they will become the leaders of that movement. So I'm not that obsessed with star leadership. On the contrary, I want everyone to be a leader.
Sure. And Lynn, obviously thinking back to 2014, and I know things were always very different then, but if you consider the role that Alex Salmon may have been, obviously taking part in the TV debates, and, you know, probably first time cutting her teeth for many people first getting involved in politics at that stage, looking forward to a leader. And many people that I've spoken to in the Yes movement, although they don't agree that there should be, certainly from the grassroots side of things, a leader, but maybe that lack of someone who's kind of steering people in the right direction is maybe something that's lacking, and kind of leads to some of the other challenges that you get in the Yes movement, such as, you know, infighting and stuff, due to a lack of activity or something they follow. Would you agree with that?
I think there is, to some extent, as a vacuum. I mean, if we look back to the 2014 referendum, we had Alec as the leader of the SNP, and he was, you know, the front person in terms of all of the mainstream media, as Charlotte explained. But we then had Yes Scotland, which did a bit of a job. But to be honest, there were other grassroots organisations that were travelling up and down the length, literally the length and breadth of Scotland. So Hope Over Fear, for example, was a very much working class grassroots organisation at the time that, you know, I remember taking Tommy Sheridan down to speak at a meeting down in Dumfries. And on the journey down, we got a phone call to say, we've had to move the venue. And I was saying to him, well, maybe they've overestimated how many people would turn up or whatever. So we got there and we went to the local cafe and had our fish tea before we went to the meeting. And it actually turned out that there was such an overspill that they had to move to a bigger venue. And the same in Dundee, in Motherwell, we went to the Motherwell Supporters Club to speak there. And we had to have 3 meetings, one in the main hall, one outside where we got photographs of people speaking up on top, standing on top of other people's cars, and then an anteroom that they had, that, you know. So there was a huge enthusiasm back then. But I don't necessarily, I agree with Charlotte to an extent. I don't think we actually, you know, you can have figureheads, but at the end of the day, it's the troops on the ground that are going to change people's minds. It's people running stalls and giving it information, talking to people. That's what's going to change your mind. If you read the mainstream media, then, you know, everything would stay the same. In this COVID crisis, the mainstream media have been given by the Scottish Government £3 million. £3 million. To do what? To attack us all, because we want to fight for our own destiny. So we have got, as Charlotte said, we've got lots of leaders. You know, we've got famous bloggers, and I'd just like to hope that everything's going okay for Grouse man there, because he's having operations today. But we've got amazing, innovative people who are campaigning for independence, and behind that sits their desires and their vision for what an independent Scotland would look like. And what we need to do, as Charlotte's saying, is bring people together to push that agenda. And if the SNP don't want to lead that, then other people will take up the cudgel of that in the future.
So Mark, what do you think? Does the Yes movement need a leader?
I agree with Charlotte and Lynn, really. I mean, I think one of the weaknesses is, as I mentioned before, I think the great strength of the movement has been the grassroots element of it. And we're seeing some of the consequences, I think, of having kind of leadership icons and the difficulties that that can lead to when things break down, as they evidently have done. And I think it would be better if I think it's better having a multitude of voices. And like I say, I mean, just not just the bloggers, but I mean, we already have that in the movement. We have effectively our own media. I mean, not just this platform, but there's loads of other independent platforms, and we're having a wide variety of voices being heard. And I think that's much better. The other thing that's great about that is it's far more difficult for our opposition to undermine it, because unless they find a way, and who knows, they may well find a way, but unless they find a way to close us all down, then you know, that's, well, it's funnily enough you said that, because I heard something today where there might be some moves, some legal moves afoot to effectively do that, and then we're in very, very dark waters if that comes to pass. But at the moment, no, I think look, there's an issue, a big question mark, a big debate around leadership issues just now. But let's face it, we're not. Our advances, as Charlotte articulated earlier, have been through grassroots activism, and I'm sure that's going to be the future going forward. And probably, if anything, the lesson that will come out of what's about to take place, or what is emerging, is that we can't have an over-reliance, because our cause is too great. We can't have an over-reliance on individuals. And so I hope it kind of generally keeps like that. Yes, we'll have big figures making their contributions, and that's all well and good. And we do need some kind of leadership, in the sense of a kind of collective leadership that understands and is determined to deliver our collective goal. But I think I'm not a fan of selfie type of leadership, if that's clear enough.
Sure. So again, Mark, another question for yourself is, hypothetically speaking, that we go to the elections in May, the SNP return the majority, and they go back to Westminster, and we need the Section 30 order, and they come back and say no. What actually is the options from there? What do we really have in our, a roadmap against, should that situation occur?
Well, they're saying they'll bring a legal challenge, but I mean, that's the position. They've been pushed into this. I mean, they've been getting press routinely, the leadership, on what is the alternative. And well, I mean, ultimately, they won't go down this road. And I think this is where the grassroots movement will have to step up. But a legal challenge could take us years down the road. It'll go all the way up to the Supreme Court, etc. And the bottom line is, because they themselves, the leadership, have painted themselves into this Section 30 route map on the advice of on legal advice from someone who's a unionist, they're going to have to concede that. They can't go back. You know, one of the things I mentioned at the time, as many people know, I know Alex Salmon fairly well. I've been a vocal supporter of his, and although it wasn't a commitment in the Edinburgh Agreement or in the White Paper in 2014, when I heard that phrase being used once in a generation, and it did appear more than once, and although it was stressed it was just his opinion, I felt immediately that was a hostage to fortune to say that. Now, I understand why it was said at the time. It was said because they wanted to focus people's minds on, if you want it and you're maybe swithering, this is your only chance. So I understand the politics behind it. It also meant that it left the movement wide open. So what I think will happen is it'll be rejected, it'll be tied up. The danger for the movement is we lose momentum. And I don't think, once it starts going into the legal frame, I think that's when the movement has to take to the streets, have mass demonstrations, blockades. I think we could learn a lot from Extinction Rebellion and some of the tactics that they've used. Peaceful, democratic, lawful, but disruptive to the institutions of the British state. If they're not going to recognise our legitimate sovereign right, then we will do everything we can to disrupt British state and British state interests in Scotland through just a physical, I don't mean a violently physical presence, but our physical presence, just to obstruct and disrupt them. And I think it will become self-evident that that's not a sustainable position for the UK to maintain. But we have to keep up the momentum, because once it goes dragged into the courts, then people will lose faith.
Lynn, have you got anything to add to that? Any slightly different view?
Just on the point that Mark made in relation to the once in a generation comment. I mean, it's written into the peace agreement, the Northern Ireland peace agreement, that for the Assembly in Northern Ireland, that a generation equates to 7 years. That's in the legislation that the Unionists wrote in terms of their peace agreement for Northern Ireland. So by my arithmetic, we exceed that this year in terms of 7 years since the last referendum, and so the Scottish Government had the opportunity to support Martin Keating's in his court case. They decided not to do so. In fact, they're now, them and the UK government are actually trying to get full costs out of him if he loses his case. So I'd ask folk to help him out in terms of his crowdfunder there. But they had the opportunity to support his submission to the courts, and they didn't. So I don't have any faith in them going back to the Tories and asking for a, it's a bit like Oliver Twist with the begging bowl, asking for a Section 30. If they put a plebiscite, the Plan B, into their manifesto, then people would clearly know what they were voting for at these Scottish elections. You vote for SNP, you're voting for us to be taking that unilateral decision and then allowing us to go and negotiate our exit from the United Kingdom. But they haven't, and I don't think they will do that, as I said earlier. So we need to get round the table and decide how best do we move forward, because, okay, they'll go and ask for a Section 30, Boris will say no, and then what do we do thereafter? And that's where the movement and the grass movement then comes into its own, I think.
So Charlotte, what do you think if we get denied the Section 30 order? Is there any different approach we could potentially take from your perspective?
I agree with Mark and Len. We need to think imaginatively. We need to think of ways in which we can disrupt the normal business of Scotland. I and Mark mentioned Extinction Rebellion. There was an anti-deportation group. I think it was just 12 of them, and they brought an entire airport to a halt. Nobody was in any danger during the action. They were arrested. They were tried under anti-terrorism laws, but their convictions have been quashed recently. And there's all sorts of things that people can do very, very quickly that maybe we will still be under some sort of restriction of gatherings. But there's all sorts of things we can do. We can stop traffic, we can stop bridges, we can just to say that this is the people now saying, we've voted, we've complied with legality and voted consistently, and yet consistently we're being ignored, and we're not prepared to be ignored anymore. So I think the thing about the grassroots movement is that there'll be lots of ideas of what people can do locally, how they can bring normal life to a halt, even if it's just for an hour. You know, you have an impact where you are locally and you have an impact nationally. But things like banner drops, things like, people are more imaginative than me, will come up with other things, you know. And one of the things that I would like to see is trade unionists taking some action, because there's absolutely no doubt, because of affiliation to the Labour Party, lots of trade unions were against independence in the referendum. Now that is not the case, and most people who vote yes are trade unionists. They're working class people who are working and are in trade unions. I want to bring that to bear a bit more in our movement, so have more social layers of society mobilised in the support of independence and the democratic right of the Scottish people. So, for example, again, I'd love it if I could call it a general strike for independence. It ain't going to happen. But nevertheless, if people are confident that there's a grassroots movement behind them, why not we're going to down tools for an hour because our democratic rights aren't being recognised. Now, it would help so much if somebody in the trade unions would actually get up and say, look, this is a democratic right. We want a referendum on the right of the Scottish people to decide. And the SDUC are actually in agreement with the IndyRef too. So let's put that into action. Let's enact that democracy by the actions of the people. So I agree with Mark. Initially small, but impactful actions. The peaceful civil disobedience that we've seen people, look at those brave young people taking part in the tunnels in London against HS2. Who knows if they will stop it or not, but at least they're showing that people are still willing to do something, to fight, to do something different to get what they believe in. If we have to believe in this enough to do that, to do something to win it, and not leave it up to the politicians. And so I think we have to think now of what we will do, even though we can't exactly predict what's going to happen. We need to be prepared, because I'll tell you what, the other side will be prepared. So yeah, absolutely. Peaceful civil disobedience very soon after May, stating this is what the people want. If you don't give us democracy, we're going to actually agitate it for ourselves.
Perfect. Mark, over to you. A question that's come in from Duncan Barron, and it's, do you think the lack of action on independence could be down to government advisors providing bad or even malicious advice?
Well, I think I mentioned this in my comments earlier, but essentially, the key advice that the Scottish Government are relying on is the advice from James Wolfe, the Lord Advocate, which is basically saying this is the only legal mechanism that you can use. In terms of the wider advice, I just think there's a complacency. When I started work at the Scottish Parliament in 1999. There was a real energy back then. All of the staff, the parliamentary political staff I'm on about within the SNP, were all hugely enthusiastic and passionate. The time I left in 2011, you could see it over the years, but you were seeing more and more politics graduates coming in as parliamentary assistants, etc., who didn't have necessarily, yes, they said they believed in independence, but what drove them more than anything was a career. And quite frankly, they could have, if the Labour Party had been in the ascendancy, they could have quite happily gone the Labour Party. So you saw, well, frankly, you saw careerists coming through. And I think that's where a lot of the lack of energy and lack of momentum has come from within the SNP. And it's been, unfortunately, it's been encouraged by the leadership to a certain extent. And so whether they're being actively advised, I think it suits the agenda. People, there was a mention of Andrew Wilson, the former SNP MSP, and he runs the lobby group Charlotte Street, the Charlotte Street Lobby, or whatever they're called, partners, I think they are. And he's very, very close to the current leadership. And they are, as we saw with the Growth Commission, very steady as she go, let's not frighten the horses. So she's taken advice from these kinds of people who have a very neoliberal, frankly, very right-wing outlook. And I think that's why we've not seen a lot of development, never mind our independence, but in terms of poverty, in terms of dealing with the problems we've got, in terms of drug abuse in Scotland. These things have been sidelined, even land reform, again, sidelined. And you've got to ask yourself the question, you know, where are they coming from politically, ultimately? I mean, what vision are they presenting of an independent Scotland, for example? What kind of Scotland do we want to live in? A little England, essentially, which we're independent, we've changed the flags, but essentially we have all the same neoliberal, unequal policies that England have. It's not the kind of society I want. It's not why I want independence. I want I want Scotland to be the shining example to other small countries. You know, we want to set the precedent of a good example to the rest of the world, and not just simply emulate the worst excesses of the Westminster system.
I think you make a great point in there. It was something that really opened my eyes in 2014, particularly after the day of the referendum vote, because there was all these teams of these young lads with ill-fitting suits, red rosettes on, and they were cheering. And it was like, you know, when I was their age, I wanted to be a rock star, but these guys seem to think that they're road to some kind of famous through politics. And it's like, whoa, what's going on here? You know, there was something completely, you know, odd and a bit ugly about the whole thing of, you know, this is what our politics come. It wasn't coming from someone who's worked in the shop floor, who's, you know, learned experience, maybe been a trade union member, and went off to try, you know, build something more important for society. It was just a career choice. It definitely was. Charlotte, what do you think? Do you think there's the government's got some potentially malicious advisors within the ranks and corridors of the Scottish Parliament?
I don't know if they're malicious or not, but they're certainly right-wing. You know, I would describe them as neoliberal, right-wing, very conventional, no vision, no blue sky thinking, nothing that would inspire anyone. Why that is, I don't know. Maybe all institutions that are in such power positions for so long but get a bit stale. I've certainly noticed, I mean, one of the incredible things about the COVID was the fact that we actually had a Minister for Public Health who you never saw or heard, but actually had to resign when the suppressed figures for the number of drug deaths was eventually published. So you get the impression, and you know, I'm not speaking for NowScotland here, but that they have totally run out of steam as an organisation. Nicola Sturgeon, for all her competence, she's a managerial type person, but behind her, who else is there? You know, that you would find is that carrying the inspiration or the vision of the party. I don't see anybody. And for all you say, as you say, it's a career option for people. It used to be, for some people, you would become a trade union bureaucrat, then into the Labour Party, or a student union person, and then into the Labour Party. I don't know where these people go now, but there certainly doesn't seem to be much in the way of talent, or depth of talent anyway, in the party. And that is actually very worrying when you want to aspire to be an independent country. So, yeah, as I say, we're going to have to rely on the grassroots movement to provide the talent, the creativity, the drive, and the vision, because it's not coming from anywhere else.
Do you think, Lynn, anything you want to add different to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would give one example, which is the bill that Mike Daly at the Govan Law Centre took forward in terms of fair rents policy. asking the Scottish Government to produce legislation on that. So in Scotland, we've not had a fair rents policy. So you get landlords, private landlords, that can charge whatever the hell they like for their wee 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom bijou flat in the West End of Glasgow or Edinburgh or whatever, extortionate rents that ordinary working class people just can't afford, and that's why they end up getting into debt, and we have what we call the working poor. Now, the Scottish Parliament took a decision and said, we can't vote on this. And he took them to court and he won his case. And so all of a sudden they said, all right, well, we'll take it to court. Now, one of the reasons why there were so many in the Scottish Parliament that didn't want to vote on it is because they've got such a big property portfolio. They are private landlords. They're sitting in there as supposedly representing the members of their constituents, but they're actually landlords as well. And I just think that's an absolute disgrace. And I also would come back on the point that Mark's made. I think that we've always had a hierarchy and a snobbery within our organisations in terms of elected officials. And it was always, as Charlotte says, in the past, you had, if you were a working class person and you became a trade unionist, you would then maybe stand as a local councillor for Labour or whatever. And to be honest, the university of life, as I call it, is absolutely ignored now within Scottish politics. So me as a trade unionist, I used to be a bus driver, was a taxi driver, then went back to university and did a degree and got a job and then did a master's, working in academia now. So I've managed to get up the ladder, but I've not pulled the ladder up behind me. And I think that's what the problem is that we've got too many individuals who think it's their chosen right or genetic right to represent people in constituencies that they're parachuted into. Half of them wouldn't know how to get to Bells Hill or Motherwell or Straven or places like that. They don't know what the issues are, but they're, there used to be a saying, you put up a certain animal and they get voted for it because they had a Labour Party rosette on. Those days are now gone. But I think SNP have to learn from history that if they're not careful, the same thing's going to happen to them. If they don't listen to people, if they don't talk to people, if they don't communicate with people about what it is the people want, they will be the next big party that will be thrown to the side. They need to learn the lessons of the Labour Party ignoring its constituents. We've had them in power since what, 98, 2001, and yet we still have a quarter of children living in poverty. As others have mentioned, the drug situation. But you've got a man in Glasgow who's trying to do his best by the drug community, and he gets arrested every other day because he's trying to offer them a clean space and a safe space to take their drugs. We can't deny the fact that people are going to use drugs. So what we need to do is look at harm reduction in terms of that. And that's what the guy Peter Kiden is doing, and he's getting criminalised for doing it. That's an absolute disgrace. So we need to get, I think all of us here would say, more radical in terms of how are we taking on these problems. People, I think, in the Parliament have become far too comfortable. They need to get a wee shake and saying, no, we're going to hold your feet to the fire. We want you to campaign on these issues that are going to make a difference for our children in Scotland. And that for me is a big passion.
Thanks very much. Well, unfortunately, that is the last question of the evening. We're sadly out of time. So just before we finish up, we'll just have a quick run through each of the speakers, just a finishing statement. I mean, you don't have to spend any great time on it. If we'll just start with Mark, if you don't mind.
Well, we've got big challenges ahead coming up. We've got certain things that will be a bit of a distraction, but I hope people will focus very firmly on becoming active if they can within their own community. Now, it's difficult with COVID. Most of the activism that's going to be done is going to be online for this election. But, you know, don't lose heart. The goal of independence has been around for a long time. It's not going to disappear overnight. And although there are going to be very, very significant and major distractions in the next little while, we're going to come out of that at the other end. And I hope, that's my sincere hope, that we're going to come out much, much stronger at the end of it, because our strength is in the grassroots movement. So there'll be a difficult period ahead. We just have to take that, I'm afraid, because it's unavoidable. But after that, we come together and we drive this thing home and get our independence sooner, not later.
Thank you, Mark. And Charlotte, closing statements from you?
Yeah, I'm just going to give a bit of a punt for NowScotland. Our website, nowscotland.scot. You can join. This is a membership organisation we're trying to build here. And it doesn't matter if you're in any other organisation or none. We are, if you look at our mission statement on the website, it's very clear. We're very open and we are welcoming of everybody. We've got an assembly coming up, an online assembly on the 21st of March. In order to attend that, you have to be a member. So you have to join first. And we also have a capacity on the website for you to upload your vision for Scotland. So exactly what we're talking about, it's not coming from the leadership of the SNP, and people feel frustrated that they don't have an outlet for that. One of the places you can go to is our NowScotland website and upload it. And we really would welcome people's different visions and different issues coming up there as well. But yes, I think we've got everything to play for. It's been difficult for us with lockdown. People have been through a lot the last year. But we've got to come out of this stronger than we were before and call our politicians to account from the grassroots up. And if we want it enough, we will fight for it enough. And I think we'll see progress this year. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Charlotte. And last but not least, Lynn, over to you.
Well, I would just ask people to go and visit the AFI website, to become active in AFI and join us, or show your support for AFI. And when the elections come in May, think and vote with your head and not necessarily just with your heart. So give us your regional vote, as you call it, Paul, or the second vote, as a lot of people call it, the peach ballot vote. Give it to a pro-independence party. Let's max the yes. Let's get pro-independence MSPs into the Parliament to push for the independence referendum that we also wish and desire.
Perfect. Thanks, Lynn. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for this evening. I just have time to thank each of our speakers for taking the time to join us this evening. And of course, to all you watching at home, and especially those who submitted the questions to our panel. And of course, to Kevin and the team at Independence Live, who, you know, without them, this simply wouldn't be possible. And just briefly to finish, I'd just like to note that Yes Kilbride are a pro-independence grassroots community group. Our constitution is firmly for all parties and none. Although our primary focus is the campaign for independence, we're proud to support East Kilbride and surrounding areas in any way we can, i.e. through supporting charities, the food banks, raising awareness, etc. And we're just one of a vast network of local grassroots community groups run by people just like you. So if you'd like to get involved in Yes East Kilbride, you can contact us by sending an email to eksays@gmail.com or by dropping us a message at any of our social media pages on Twitter or Facebook. And if you're not near East Kilbride, then get yourself online and get signed up with your own local pro-independence group, because a better future can only be delivered by you. So I want to wish you good night, stay safe, and we look forward to welcoming you at one of our up and coming events. Good night.